Hi, I am Virginia Cruel, and I will do a 10-minute video presentation on the major philosophers of phenomenology. When we think of phenomenology, we often think of the term philosophy. If we think back in history, one of the great Greek philosophers was Aristotle, who had great thought in the word phenomenology and philosophy as well. A great quote that he once quoted was, "To be conscious that we are perceiving or thinking is to be conscious of our own existence." So, let's take a look at what is phenomenology.
Phenomenology is, by the dictionary, was given several different definitions. Let's look at the first definition. It is a philosophy or method of inquiry based on the premise that reality consists of objects and events. The second definition consists of the science of phenomenon as a distinct from being ontology, derived from the Greek word phenomenon, which means appearance. The third definition states it is a study of structures of consciousness as experienced from the first person's point of view. And lastly, it is defined as it emphasizes the immediacy of experience, the attempt to isolate and set it off from all assumptions of existence. The origin. The origin of phenomenology began as far back as the mid-1890s in Germany by Edmund Husserl. Before World War I, it was spread to Japan, Russia, and Spain. And during the early 20th century, it spread to many parts of the world in search of research of education, religion, communicology, literature, and politics. But as we know it, phenomenology was studied at universities in Germany, Göttingen, and Munich. But we come to know that phenomenology is indeed the most influential and significant movement in the stream of philosophical thought on the European continent during the 20th century. Pioneers in the field of phenomenology. Let's start back with the teacher, Franz Bertano. He taught Edmund Husserl. Franz Bertano was a German philosopher and psychologist who studied different types of mental phenomena. In one of his works, Thesis of Intentional Directness, it was noted that it was the hallmark of his descriptive psychology. This was the spark and foundation to Husserl's new science of phenomenology. Who was Karl Stumpf? He was a colleague of Edmund Husserl. He was a German philosopher and psychologist who was inspired by Franz Bertano as well. He was also known as the pioneer of comparative musicology and ethnomusicology. But if we look at the students of Edmund Husserl, we know them to be Edith Stein, Max Scheler, Nikolai Hartmann, Paul Ricoeur, Emmanuel Levinas, and Alfred Schultz. So, let's focus our attention on the major four phenomenological philosophers: Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Jean-Paul Sartre. First, let's look at Edmund Husserl. Edmund Husserl launched phenomenology from 1900 to 1901, and through this time, he worked on a major work called the logical investigation. Through logical investigation, two theories were developed, which included psychological and semantic theory, which can be traced back as far as Aristotle. Through this work, we also looked at ideas that were mixed with logic and descriptive psychology, which correlates logic to the study of objective ideas, including propositions, which in turn make up objective theories. But if you look at the psychology side of it, that is, by contrast, it studies the subjective ideas. We look at concrete contents of mental activities in particular minds at a given time. But we know that phenomenology will then be study the complexity of consciousness. This is when we saw it came through the works of Ideas 1. And under Ideas 1, Husserl introduced two new Greek terms called noesis and noema, which means to perceive, think, or intend. From this, a radical new science of phenomenology has taken place through Ideas 1. From this point, it became to be known as a theory of intentionality and finally a theory of knowledge. Martin Heidegger. He was one of the four main philosophers as well. He worked as Edmund Husserl's assistant in 1916, and in 1928 he succeeded Husserl as the prestigious chair at the University of Freiburg. He worked on two different works as well. His first work was in 1927, which was called Being and Time, which involved the idea that we and our activities are always in the world, and our being is always being in the world. But this was looked at from the contextual sense. Now let's look at it on the other hand, from a different style, the basic problems of phenomenology. Heidegger traced the questioning of the meaning of being as far back as Aristotle. This is where ontology became apparent and consonant with his vision in his logical investigation. This is when the most innovative idea was founded, the conception of the ground theory of being. Now, let's look at our third philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. We know that he worked hand in hand with Sartre in 1940. He also developed some works as well. His two works were known as the Phenomenology of Perception, both in 1945, but he looked at it from a different perspective within the experimental psychology area. This is where he analyzed the experiences of amputees who dealt with sensations of phantom limb pain. From that point, he dealt with the correlation between sensations and stimulus. His attention was focused on the body image. When we looked at in Phenomenology of Perception, more attention was paid to the experience of the body, the spatiality of the body, the temporality of the body, and the character of freedom. Now, let's look at our last philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre. He was known as the father of existentialist philosophy. He was known to study existentialism and Marxism. We also know that he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize but declined on several occasions. But we must look at two of his famous works, Nausea, who studied how ordinary objects lose their meaning when they're being encountered with the being. And in the other works, we looked at Being and Nothingness, which was written while he was a prisoner of war. He emphasized that there was a freedom of choice. He developed his conception of phenomenological ontology, and this became the foundational work for existentialism. As we know, Sartre is also known for the notion that existence precedes essence, the idea of bad faith and nothingness. So, as we have talked about the major philosophers, let's go back to the term of phenomenology. There are various types of phenomenology: transcendental phenomenology, realistic phenomenology, existential phenomenology, naturalistic phenomenology, and hermeneutical phenomenology. Let's look at the main three that we need to pay attention to. Transcendental, which looks at how objects are constituted in pure or transcendental consciousness, setting aside a question of the relation to the natural world. Let's look at realistic phenomenology. This is when we study the structures of consciousness and intentionality, assuming it occurs in the real world. Lastly, let's look at existential phenomenology. This is when we study concrete human existence, including our experience of free choice or action in concrete situations. Now, let's look at the different types of discipline within phenomenology. Several terms. First, ontology. That is the study of beings or thing beings. In layman's terms, it's what we call what is. Let's look at epistemology. That is the study of knowledge. How do we know? Let's look at logics. It is the study of valid reasoning. How to reason. Look at ethics. We know that is the study of what is right and wrong, how we should act. And lastly, let's look at phenomenology. It is basically the study of our experience and how we experience things. Now, This presentation or slideshow shows you the pioneers of phenomenology. First, if you look at the picture on the left, that's Franz Mattano, who we know was a great teacher at the University of Göttingen and Munich. Let's look at the middle picture. That is Edmund Husserl, who we know as what we call the founder of phenomenology. And lastly, to the right, that's a colleague of Edmund Husserl and a student of Franz Mattano as well, which is Carl Stump. Now, the last slide is very interesting. We see the four major philosophers. We see Edmund Husserl, we see Jean-Paul Sartre, we see Martin Heidegger, and we see Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And when we think of all these great philosophers, we think of phenomenology, we think of philosophy, we think of Aristotle, but we also think of phenomenology as dealing with the mind. And all these people were great thinkers in the area of phenomenology. So, as we wrap up this presentation, we would like to know how does these major philosophers and its major influence, how does it relate to our next presentation, which will look at how does phenomenology relate to philosophical views that influence nursing knowledge development and nursing theory. Thank you.